Hello, welcome to the UX+Data meetup. Design versus data, a battle royale featuring Jess Dale. Jess has been designing things since she discovered the internet on a dial-up connection. How did you dial up?
Using a modem.
Using a modem.
14.4.
Was it like Prodigy? Like CompuServe?
I think it might have been Prodigy.
Wow.
Yeah.
There you go. That's impressive. I think Prodigy was my first too.
Yeah.
We'll chat later and
we'll catch up on that.
Cool. And she's worked on products for teachers, patients, comic book fans, asset managers, job seekers, and foster care youth. Let's give a round of applause for Jess Dale.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all. So I'm curious, who here works with a PM? Yeah, okay. Who here works with a designer? Great. Wave to each other. PMs, designers, I wrote this talk for you. So my talk is not about Fortnite, but I am going to talk to you about winning a battle and reflecting on that battle, what I learned from it, and what it means to win. And I wrote the title of this talk one day when I was feeling particularly feisty at work because I was struggling to understand something that my PM was asking me to do. So we were in conversation. I had finished a design that I was working on tirelessly. And I shared that design with them, and they said, hey, Jess, this looks great, but we're going to need to run a test for at least 2 weeks to make sure that we get stat sig on how this is going to affect our AOV before we ramp to 100%. And a lot of other acronyms came up in that conversation that I was not familiar with. So that exchange left me feeling pretty confused. I was like, whoa, what are you talking about? I already made a design decision. I created the design, and I'm really not understanding why you think we need to justify my design work with numbers. This was new for me because I think, like many designers, my answers typically come from things like user interviews, from surveys, from working with other designers and getting feedback from my team. They come from this thing we call best practices. They come from my own experience. And I was really struggling to understand in that moment why my experience and intuition wasn't enough. And I felt like I had a lot to back up my decisions, and I don't know why I was being questioned. But you know, PMs, they want to get their answers from numbers and data. It's like their bread and butter, and how they figure stuff out, and like how they measure what something is really successful. And that's the stuff that matters to them. So this conversation brought up a really big question for me. Should designers be using data? And in this case, I mean specifically quantitative data, numbers. Because I was starting to feel like my design process and my experience wasn't enough. And then I was like questioning everything I was doing and what I was making, and I didn't like that feeling. So the battle began. I'm going to give you a quick Jess Dale intro to A/B tests. So in A/B testing, how many people are familiar with A/B testing? Okay, everyone knows, great, that's great. Here's my version of this story. So an A/B test is basically where you're creating a variant or many variants of an existing product. Usually it's a page or maybe a specific component on that page. And you're creating these variations so that you might learn if there's any significant change in user behavior. For example, they purchase more things. And it's usually an A/B test around measuring like some metric that your company cares about. So an example of A/B testing might be you run a test where you change the messaging on a page that you think might help increase revenue or increase conversion rate. And A/B tests have become one of the primary ways that product teams try to use data and numbers to make decisions or influence design. So here I am. I'm feeling caught in this battle that I need to win, that I need to like defend myself. And on one hand, I'm conflicted, right? Because designers, primarily their job is about creating products, and it's about, figuring out ideally like what the user need is and solving for that. But ultimately, you're trying to meet a business objective at the very least so that you can pay people salaries, right? So it's not that I'm not cognizant of that or that that's like not important to me, but I think I really, really, really care about the user's experience. And I was feeling like my PM was asking me to abandon one in favor of the other. And I started like having all these thoughts about dark patterns, and that was swirling around in my brain. And I'm like wondering if we're being deceptive. Are we trying to like do something just to gain percentage points? And I'm really wondering in all this, like what's more important in my role as a designer? Is it making an impact against a metric, or is it solving a user problem? And for me, it feels really hard to argue against A/B tests. They promise so much. They are promising that you're gonna like be able to compare something and like remove the guesswork from your decision making, and they're gonna help you like measure the impact against these metrics that your PM really cares about and give you all these positive results that really affect your bottom line. And people get excited by that. And they start falling in love with what A/B tests could do for us. And I think that's natural. Everybody loves an easy solution. I think everyone wants to have a simple choice, right? We want that promise to be true, and we want to be able to prove it and show the numbers to the people that care about them. And, also like give some confidence in what the team is working on, like directionally, does it make sense that we're doing this thing? So we start collecting data to justify our decisions. And suddenly, we're asking a lot of our A/B tests. We're saying things like, should we do this? I don't know, let's test it. Should we make our buttons green instead of red? I don't know, let's test it. And we see results, right? Like we see 88% increase in clicks, and that's what we want. So we start getting cocky and we're like, we feel like we can solve everything with A/B tests. And we start asking, what else can we test? And slowly, we began removing some of the thinking about our work and the thinking about the problems that we're trying to solve. And we try to shortcut to easy answers. And inevitably, we become overly reliant on these metrics and these results. And it gets to a point that we're like kind of abusing A/B tests a little bit because we're asking the A/B tests to answer questions it's not meant to. And we start blending both impact on the metric and the user experience, and we lose that like crispness of the question and the clarity of the signal. And I think it makes sense that we get caught up in the A/B tests and the results that we get out of them because you think you're getting something that's neutral and unbiased, and you think you're going to have this tool that's going to help your team move from like a hunch to a sure thing that you feel confident about, and that you're going to get this winning variant out of it, and that translates to dollars, so that's important. But in reality, you're getting a large amount of data that was collected with an intent with assumptions and with a story already in mind. And that can lead you down the wrong path. And sometimes, you get numbers standing in for rigor and objectivity, and then your confirmation bias factors into that too, and it's telling you only to be paying attention to the information that aligns with what you want to believe or what you already believe, and then it's hard to combat against that when you're looking for the right answer. Other times you run A/B tests and you get false positives, or the results are inconclusive and you don't really learn anything from it. I think what's really problematic about A/B tests is that they try to take a very complex process and collapse it down into yes or no answers. They're kind of devoid of the larger context. You're also ruling out a lot of potential choices because you've set up your test in a way where you're comparing one thing against another. And that's making an assumption that you've chosen the right two things to be in that test. I think the other thing that A/B tests ignore is the sort of net effects or broader changes across the whole system, and how that matters. It could be that changing the buttons on one page have a measurably positive effect, and then your PM might say, absolutely, we have to do this. Why not? We're leaving money on the table if we don't go for that. But why? You're missing that. So I'm questioning these tests, right? I'm questioning what my PM's asking me about my design. I'm questioning why we need to A/B test it. And I think you can make assumptions all day about why something outperforms something, but you're not going to figure out why. It could be that A does outperform B, but it doesn't show how effective A is or why that was, just that it's better than B. I think the whole thing goes sideways pretty quick. Collecting data to justify a decision isn't necessarily bad, but I think it does become a slippery slope. Without a clearly articulated hypothesis, A/B tests are probably going to do more harm than good, or at the very least will be useless. If you're trying to use them to make decisions, it's something that you need to really clarify. So the danger of A/B tests for me are that they create this false confidence and they ignore the why, which I think is what you really need to have confidence in something. Truthfully, A/B tests can prove anything that you want them to. For example, a test could indicate that green button outperforms red button, but what about blue button? I think even successful A/B tests only allow you to validate your designs within the context of the test itself. And that makes them pretty unreliable as a design decision tool. So if you're not stepping back to look at the larger system, you're not going to get an accurate picture of what's happening. So be clear about how you plan to use A/B tests or A/B test results even, which should be about site optimization or hitting conversion goals, or usually trying to make an impact on that metric that your team cares about. But be skeptical of that when you're thinking about those results and you're looking at them and you're reading them and you want to get super excited about what you're seeing and how much money you're making. Remember that A/B tests are going to give you a result, but that result will probably say more about you and what you expect to define than it does about your users. So this is a pivotal moment for me in Battle, right? It's a moment where I feel like I need to make a move. I'm thinking I should probably grab the wheel and veer us away from A/B tests. But then what? If we're not going to use A/B tests, what do we do? And I think, I get it. Everyone wants to boil it down to a simple answer and know what will win. But we're not just thinking about one button on one page. We have to think about the whole system. And it's our job as designers and as product managers to take into account other things as well, and keep track of what's happening across the entire experience. So maybe designers could think about how they reframe data. And again, in this case, I mean quantitative data. Maybe you already have. I will admit it took me a long time to come around on this one. But I started thinking about like what it could look like if I were to combine my powers with my PM. And we started to use data to like build upon our context and understanding the complexity of the system instead of abstracting it away into numbers. And then I was thinking, like, maybe there's a way we could combine quant and qual, and maybe there's a way that my PM and I could start speaking the same language. If I want to bring them on this ride with me, we need to figure out a shared way of thinking and communicating with each other. And I think if you're combining quant and qual, ultimately what you want to do is take your data and make it actionable. So you'll remember, initially I was feeling really defensive. If I'm being honest, I was feeling pretty angry as well. And I was really tripped up by this language that I didn't understand. But it shifted for me when I started to think about how to make data actionable, and thinking about maybe there's like some framework that we could use to move data into a usable state. And once I started thinking about that, I visualized it, of course, because that's what designers do. Pictures are awesome for figuring out how to communicate, and this moment really, for me, shifted my thinking. It helped me see that data isn't enough to make good decisions. We need more than that. But that we could use data as our starting point, and then we can ask, what more can we get out of this? So let me talk you through this visualization. There are 4 layers to using data in decision making. So the first layer is data, which is any measurable measurement or observation. The next one is information, which is that data in context. The next one is, wow, so tiny, knowledge. And knowledge is information for a purpose. And then finally, experience. And experience tells you when knowledge goes wrong. So let me give you an example. Data. Let's say data is the number of vehicles passing your house. So the knowledge would be, information would be the direction and frequency of buses with their route numbers, okay? And the knowledge would be, I know I want to catch the number 444 bus to the airport, and that goes past my house every 35 minutes. So then experience would be knowing that due to poor maintenance, only 1 in 3 buses actually makes it to the airport. So I can make my decision accordingly. And this visualization of how I was thinking about data, it didn't only unlock something from me, which was helpful, but I think what really made the big difference was that I could show this to my PM and I could say, look, this is how I think about data. This is how I think we could use this data. And I can say to them, I think it's a good starting point, but we need to do the work to put this data in context, and try to understand enough information to uncover the full picture so that we can start collecting the knowledge we need to make decisions. And we can work on creating these building blocks together to make data useful for us, that combination of quant and qual. And that can help us formulate better questions and understand what we want to learn. And then we can get exactly what it is that we want from that data. So all you designers who raised your hand earlier, I encourage you to get more comfortable with this subject, probably aim for much more comfort than I had, and do your research. It just so happens that there was a book written on this exact topic. It's very good. I recommend buying it. It's written by some folks who are very design-minded, and I think that the way that they talk about data is really smart and fits really nicely within the design process. Because it's going to be your job to design what you want to validate. You're going to want to be clear about the data that's going to best help you measure and articulate the effect that your design has on your users and on your business objectives. I think you could even take that a step further and think about, what do you do if your assumption proves true? What are you going to design then? Or what if it's false? What do you design then? I think if you're part of a larger team, you could even take that a step further and start visualizing that or planning it. But I think even as a first step, this is good. You want to make sure that you're thinking about the data capture and analysis and the questions that you want to ask as part of your design process. And together you're going to work with your PM to get the framing right. You want to make sure you're collecting the right signals, you understand the knowledge that you need, and you have an understanding of and know how to solve the right problems. So clarify your questions and your assumptions. And make sure that you get the framing right, because it will have a compounding effect on all your subsequent work. And the other important thing is that you're always going to have to do the work to investigate. Always. Of course, you're going to be cognizant of the impact on business, but you also need to be hearing from users. And there's an element of instinct, I think, that's part of design. It's about talking to users and relying a little bit on your instinct, but it can't be solely based on intuition. It's a problem-solving framework. So you need to be able to evaluate these solutions that you're coming up with. And these are the important steps that you need to be bringing your PM along with you on. You need to be letting them know how you're thinking about this, how you are working through this process, and making sure that you're balancing the quantitative with the qualitative, and that you're asking of your PM to do that with you as well. Because ultimately you're going to use both of those inputs, qualitative and quantitative, to form your testable hypotheses. Remember that insights are not going to give you answers, so steer clear of this idea of winning results, or grab the wheel if you feel like you need to grab the wheel, because quant is not going to tell you why something happened, right? You will have to do the work of understanding why. And understanding why will help you to sharpen your decisions in the solutions that you're coming up with. Because why will tell you the way. So, key takeaways. Data is not going to tell you what the problem is. It's not going to tell you how to solve it. It can help you expose problems. It can provide more information about those problems. And you could use that information to evaluate the problems from different angles, and then use those results to come up with better ideas. And I think it's also important that you go with your gut as a designer. That's something that's really important to me, but you need to be able to back it up, and you have to acknowledge what your assumptions on your gut are based off of. So going back to the red and green example, I think, as a designer, I might say that I think using the green button is how we're using it across the system. It makes for a consistent user experience. And in talking to users, I understand how they respond to that. And then we might also have data that we've collected from A/B tests that back that up. But ultimately, you and your PM are going to have to make a judgment about what's important to you and what isn't. And you want to make sure that you have all of the knowledge available to you. So, even though my plan was to be the last man standing, throughout this battle, I learned that winning for me was more about figuring out how to communicate with my PM, to be able to get on the same page as my PM, so that we could begin developing a partnership and really understand how to turn quant and qual into actionable insights, and strike the balance between design and data. That's it. Thank you.
All right, so we'll do some Q&A. I'm just going to ask you to please let me get to you with the microphone before you ask your question. All right? Just raise your hand for any questions.
So I'm curious, what did the end result look like? So we know that at the end of an A/B test, you have some sort of variation that's winning out, and at the end of qualitative research, we have some sort of sentiment analysis or customer interview or usability test that we have qualitative reason as to why one thing works versus the other. What is the partnership of the designer and the product manager? What does the end report look like that says, we know from a quantitative perspective this wins, and from the qualitative perspective this wins?
Yeah, good question. So I think it's, for me, what it has looked like in practice is in that process where I'm talking about the designers thinking about the data that you want to capture. It's kind of worked out that in that part of the process, me and my PM are talking about what do we want to learn from this? How are we going to measure the success of it? What are the numbers that are important to us? What are the business objectives that we're trying to hit? And that typically sits inside of larger OKRs that our team has that are about impacting those metrics. But we also start designing what that analysis will look like as well. And most recently, it's been taking an A/B test that we put up on the site, looking at the results from that, which didn't give us any statistical significance to be able to make a clear call, and taking that change of the product and taking it into user interviews and trying to understand more and unpack more with users.
Hi, so I'm wondering how your experience with A/B testing has changed since your start as a UX designer and currently, because I'm sure that in the beginning you had way different expectations of what your stats and data can bring you from those.
Yeah, good question. I guess I would say in the beginning, I understood what we were trying to get from A/B test, but being a designer by trade, I never really felt like that was landing for me. I didn't really understand how that should be part of my process. To me, it felt much more like a business tool that we would use to understand whether we're making good or bad business decisions. And so I guess now the way I think about A/B tests is that they have a very specific use, and I think you need to be clear about what you're trying to get out of an A/B test before running one. So change. I guess I would say I changed from not really understanding the point of A/B testing to now understanding that there is a point for A/B testing, but that point is probably outside of the scope of understanding users or design decisions?
My experience is that the two work hand in hand. My takeaway from a lot of your talk was that it's one or the other, or they're somehow enemies. But quite often, the qualitative assessment is used to develop initial hypotheses. And this is the direction we think we should go into. And the quantitative is used to validate that or to provide additional perspective. There's synergy between the two. And you always rank what findings would be most important to you. So what finding would I absolutely make a decision on? And then what finding, it's nice to know, but it wouldn't necessarily be something I put the bank on.
Yeah.
So I just wondered, is that an approach that you use a lot? 'Cause my takeaway was it's just one or the other. And if a company is really claiming to be customer-centric, which is a buzzword, a buzz term nowadays, would you not have to have some quantitative assessment so that your bias isn't governing the decisions of the product and it's really the customer? I know I said a lot there. Was all that clear?
Yes. No, very clear. Okay, so I'm going to break it down a little bit. To your first point, I do think it's important that there's a relationship between both. You need both. I think what I have seen, what I have heard, what I have read is like there's a lot of use of the word data-driven decisions, data-driven decision-making, data-driven design, which like really freaks me out because I don't think data matters if you can't understand it. I think a number is a number and a result is a result, and that result might have an effect, like it could increase your revenue. But I think to your point about being customer-centric, that is all about understanding your users. And I think the tricky part and where some of the confirmation bias stuff comes up is like, if you're not just trying to learn about your users and understand why they're doing something, you're gonna default to looking for the right answer or looking for something that confirms what you believe. So I don't know if I think that there's a risk in biasing your decisions based on learning too much from your users, but I think there is a risk of confirmation bias, certainly if you are only paying attention to what you want to hear from them. Did that answer your question?
I think so. You said, I just want to make sure I'm clear. You said bias from what you're hearing from your users?
Well, I think your interpretation, what you hear, is going to be biased based on what you are trying to learn, right? So, like when you're interviewing users, you might have an assumption or an expectation or a theory, and the bias will be in hearing that during that interview session from users, or even synthesizing what you learned from users is to only gravitate towards those things that you wanted to believe or that you previously believed, and ignoring the things that don't confirm. Yeah.
Yeah, a comment and a question. I'm really glad you're emphasizing understand what you want to test, because I think all that skepticism that you're talking about should be about the design of the A/B test rather than the results that you get back.
Yeah.
As a psychologist with 30 years of experience, I know all the experience and design. An experiment is a designed problem. You never do it by yourself. You bring in people to cut it to pieces before you ever collect any data. So kudos for that. But my question harkens back to an extremely old psychology paper. Most of you weren't born when it was written. It was called "You Can't Play 20 Questions with Nature and Win." And a very famous psychologist named Alan Newell wrote this against the type of psychology which we have now grabbed onto in design of I have a hypothesis. Is it true or is it not? I have another hypothesis. Is it true or is it not? And he characterized that as playing 20 questions, okay? Because you have to play a lot of 20 questions to get any understanding. So his paper was a position paper to say, we need theory. And I'd like to ask you your thoughts on, rather than qualitative only, or quantitative only, or both together, what is the role of theory that lets us predict the next situation, get in the ballpark, without having to build it and do A/B tests?
That's a great question. What is the role of theory in our process of creating products? I don't know if we've made space for that. I feel like, for me personally, the way that decisions primarily get made is based on how long it takes to make them. And that means that, you know, the design of your test will fail you. It means that the interviews that you do, you will introduce your own bias. Or sometimes you'll run an A/B test and the result will be inconclusive, and then you make a decision anyway. So I think I'd like to try to answer that question, but I need to think about it more.
We'll talk.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I ask though why, even if you do have something theory-based, why you think that would eliminate the need for A/B testing? Because I would have thought that theory, even the presence of a theory and the work within the framework of a theory would not eliminate the need. And I'd like to understand why you think it would.
I said a theory could get you in the ballpark. Okay, so the question is more, the way I think about it is, sometimes it's not worth doing the test because you might have, so there's theories about how efficient something will be based on decades of psychology research for skilled users. There's theories called information foraging theory that can kind of tell you whether a web page will be more navigable than another one. So you can do a broad-based analysis of a couple of different designs and say, theory says, you know, these two are way better than those other 6. And now if it really matters because I'm making 1/10 of a cent on every click, then at least the theory has put you in the ballpark to test the important ones, the ones that you cannot distinguish between on the basis of theory.
Is theory another word for best practice?
No, theory is not another word for best practice. Theory is actually often computational. Okay, so you can have a model of a human, and you can run it on a couple of different situations. It's based on psychological theory with a lot of different psychological principles underneath, like how the human eye works, how the knowledge works, how the hand works, how the tongue works. I mean, IBM had this fabulous thing that was called Watson's Chef, and it used mathematical theories of human taste to pick out things that made good recipes. But it was a mathematical model, a theory of human taste. And there's an awful lot of theories that have been tested in the psychology lab that can be used, I believe, to help with design in the real world. And I don't work for IBM anymore. Not when they did that.
Any other questions in this bank?
Very good talk. Thank you so much. Really resonate what I learned from my job. I work at corporate investment banks, so sometimes our users are traders, analysts. Lucky for me, because the traders' behavior hasn't changed that much for the past decade. So we establish persona, we understand what they like, what they don't like. And just a quick comment back to the lady there. I feel like the psychology definitely helped a lot of typical user behavior in terms of usability. But human preferences, is it too red or is it not red enough? I feel like that different product, different region, different market will really have differences. It's really hard to categorize. So, oh, people in California like this red, and people in New York I like that red. I think A/B tests could help some of these kind of preferences type of verification. But in terms of behavior, I agree with you. A lot of contextual information might determine is it valid research or not.
Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. This is sort of embarrassing, but I thought this was your data was going to be about Battle Royale games and design.
Totally
so
could see why you'd think that.
Yeah, so I'm curious what your current project is and what kind of data you collect and stuff. Yeah.
So I work at a company called Teachers Pay Teachers, which is a two-sided marketplace for buyers and sellers in the education space to buy and share and create and sell educational content. So we run lots of A/B tests. We collect lots of data as well about our users. I think one of the interesting things about our users in particular is we have a very strong relationship with one of those groups, which is the people who sell their educational materials on TPT. So we get to spend a lot of time talking with them, developing relationship with them, understanding how they're thinking about their businesses, and incorporate a lot of that into the work that we do. And on the other side of that, we have this very large market of buyers who we talk to a fair amount, but have less of a relationship with in the same way that we do with our sellers. So rely a bit more on looking at sort of the data in aggregate, in particular around our funnel. And that's primarily where we run a lot of our A/B tests.
Thanks. I really enjoyed your talk. Transitioning from the position of QA and being someone on the engineering team, I'm curious. I've witnessed the PM Design Alliance with this kind of A/B testing or situation. I'm wondering. Sometimes it feels like there's a lack of involvement of bringing in the engineering team, and I think it's a valid. It can be a bigger team effort, and I was just curious if you had thoughts on that, or using the engineering team to pull different types of data for you that you might not get through user interviews.
Yeah,
things like that.
definitely. Yes, the answer to your first question, I think there's a weird dynamic that happens, right, where either a PM and designer will be very tightly partnered, or they'll be at odds with each other, or sometimes both. I've had that experience. And the trick is always like getting to this thing that we call like the triad or the tripod or the triangle, the trifecta, whatever your name for it is. But it's basically this like relationship that's three-sided where you have engineering representation, design representation, product representation. So I've worked in places where I've seen that was not a relationship that happened at all. The engineers weren't involved at all. The engineers didn't want to be involved at all. And I've worked at places like where I work now, where the engineering lead is very much a part of these conversations. And in fact, to that point, we have just started doing some user interviews over this past week to understand what was important to people when they think about standards in educational content, which is like a whole thing. But what we had was the opportunity to have our engineers work on collecting data. In this case, we have a ratings and review system on our site. So they could pull data reports on everything that anyone had ever said in those comment boxes, and then filter out what we were looking for specifically related to standards. So I think we underutilize engineers for sure. But in this case, I felt like we were really successful in talking as a team about what we wanted to understand and what we were going to try to get out of our user interviews. And they could make the suggestion to say, I think there's another source of data that we could utilize.
All right, thank you very much, Jess. Let's get a round of applause for Jess Dale. Thank you, Jess. So I have a couple of meetups to announce that are coming up. The first is for Data and the Greater Good. And Data and the Greater Good is a sibling meetup. For this meetup, it's like a spun off. And hey, Elaine, how are you doing? Do you want to actually mention a little bit about the March 25th meetup?
Absolutely. So as Matt mentioned, the sister meetup, Data and the Greater Good, we will have a meetup here on March 25th. And in Data and the Greater Good, if you have not been to one of our meetups, our focus is the use of data and digital transformation and data innovation and mission-driven organizations. So some of the organizations we've had have been the Met, Lincoln Center, MoMA, and we will have the executive director of New York Cares here talking about how they use data to recruit volunteers. So I hope to see all of you here at the same location and time on March 25th.
Thank you, Elaine. And then UX and Data is back here on April 10th. We'll have Claire Galnick. She'll be here, and she'll tell you why no one is looking at your summary statistics. So we hope to see you soon. I think we still have lots of pizza, hang out and meet someone, and we hope to see you again real soon. Thank you very much.